The global trading system was rocked by an image that spread rapidly across social media. Hundreds of containers, stacked high under the sun at Mexico's Pacific Gateway, the port of Manzanillo, abandoned and left to decay. Nearly 900 containers filled with Chinese goods were deserted by their owners, a number that represented a 300% increase compared to the same period the year before. What should have been merchandise worth billions was left to rot in port yards, collecting storage fees that exceeded the value of their contents and finally destined to be dumped as garbage. For many observers, this was not simply an accident or a miscalculation. It was a sign that the Chinese export model itself had reached a breaking point. The containers, each valued conservatively at 400,000 yuan, represented far more than manufactured goods. Inside them were months of overtime wages, hopes of families who depended on factory shifts, and the sweat of workers in provinces like Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Fujian. And yet, rather than fight the system, exporters walked away. Why? Because Mexico had finally decided to crack down on the gray practices that had long allowed Chinese goods to slip into the North American market disguised, undervalued, or mislabeled. The country deployed high-tech scanning systems, gamma-ray and X-ray machines, specialist inspection teams, chemists, and even trained dogs. Any suspicious shipment was torn open, inspected layer by layer, and most of what came out was counterfeit: perfumes, handbags, sneakers, tools, tiles, tires, cosmetics, and textiles. Almost everything seized carried signs of fake branding, forged documents, or undeclared goods. For the Chinese exporters, the choice became brutally simple: pay crushing fines, face lawsuits and risk criminal charges, or abandon the shipment and cut their losses. Many chose the latter, creating the spectacle of a sea of containers left behind, symbols of an economy that once prided itself on being the factory of the world, now exposed as the source of global counterfeit. The Mexican government was not acting in isolation. Its motivations were clear. For years, Washington had accused Beijing of using Mexico as a backdoor into the American consumer market, exploiting the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to bypass tariffs and sanctions. Pressure mounted on Mexico to demonstrate that it was not colluding with Chinese smugglers. At the same time, small and medium-sized Mexican factories, especially those producing textiles, footwear, and light consumer goods, were being destroyed by the flood of underpriced imports from China. Protecting domestic industry was not just a matter of economics, it was a matter of political survival. In January 2025, President Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo announced that Mexico would cut Chinese imports to protect national industry and reinforce ties with the United States and Canada. From that point forward, customs agencies had their mandate: no mercy. By March, Mexican officials had already seized counterfeit goods worth $16 million in Mexico City, raiding 33 containers filled with speakers, bicycles, scooters, toys, clothing, and office supplies, all of them smuggled with forged papers. By June, the spectacle of abandoned containers at Manzanillo confirmed that the crackdown had shifted into high gear. What shocked many was not simply the volume of seizures, but the brazenness of the deception. Customs officials reported widespread use of falsified invoices, misdeclared values, mismatched packing lists, and incomplete documentation. One shipment of electric scooters worth $500 each was declared at $100 apiece. Some cargoes were routed through 5 or 6 shell companies, each altering the paperwork to muddy the trail. In consolidated containers, if even one item was deemed suspicious, the entire load was blocked, creating massive collateral damage. Many Chinese forwarders gambled on these tactics, but as enforcement tightened, their operations collapsed. The crisis was not confined to Mexico. On June 26, 2025, Europe launched its own thunderous strike against Chinese smuggling. Under the codename Caraliso, the European Public Prosecutor's Office coordinated raids across 14 countries, seizing 480 containers in a single sweep. Customs offices, freight companies, private homes, consultancies, and law firms were searched simultaneously in Bulgaria, Greece, France, and Spain. The results revealed a sprawling smuggling empire controlled by Chinese networks, systematically evading customs duties and value-added taxes at colossal scale. The seizures included mountains of textiles, shoes, scooters, and e-bikes. Enforcement teams confiscated luxury watches, handbags, jewelry, 27 vehicles, 11 properties, and more than 5.8 million euros in cash, including cryptocurrency wallets. In Greece, entire real estate portfolios, bank accounts, and vessels were frozen. Investigators discovered that the port of Piraeus, once hailed as a flagship of Chinese investment after Costco took a controlling stake, had become infected with corruption. More than 30 insiders, from dock workers to customs officials, had been bribed, enabling Chinese freight forwarders to build a gray clearance network hidden in plain sight inside one of Europe's busiest ports. For the European Union, the damage was staggering. Losses to tax evasion from scooters and e-bikes alone reached $250 million in 3 months, while VAT fraud added another $450 million. The total blow, nearly $700 million, underscored the cost of Beijing's export practices. 10 suspects, including customs officers, were arrested, and weapons were found in their homes. European media labeled it historic in scale, not just for the amount of goods seized, but for the exposure of how deeply China's smuggling networks had embedded themselves into European trade. The shockwaves extended far beyond financial statistics. For exporters back in China, especially in Guangdong and Zhejiang, the seizures were catastrophic. Over 300 factories were implicated by the containers stranded in Europe. A textile exporter in Shaoxing admitted in tears that if the goods were not released within a week, his entire workforce of 300 would be unemployed. Shipping costs had already soared by 30%. Clearance times had stretched from 3 days to 15, and inspection rates had risen above 20%. By mid-2025, Chinese container declarations at Greek ports had dropped 45%, a collapse that rerouting through Spain or the Netherlands could not solve, because European cross-checks now flagged undervalued shipments systematically. For workers inside China, the story was one of despair. Many had labored for months of overtime, producing goods that would never reach consumers. Their wages disappeared as their employers drowned in fines and abandoned stock. Families that depended on factory paychecks suddenly faced hunger. The images of locked factory gates, empty workshops, and unpaid workers confronting managers captured the human cost of China's counterfeit export model. Yet Beijing itself offered no relief. Instead of acknowledging the systemic corruption that fueled counterfeit production, officials dismissed the seizures as isolated incidents, blaming foreign protectionism. This narrative failed to convince anyone. Across Mexico, Europe, and even parts of Asia, governments were increasingly united in seeing Chinese goods not as a boon but as a threat. Critics argue that the crisis is the inevitable outcome of China's refusal to reform. For decades, the country relied on flooding the world with underpriced goods, many of them counterfeits or products of gray trade routes. By propping up this system, Beijing not only undermined fair competition abroad, but also hollowed out its own economy. Rather than invest in innovation, many companies chose the faster path of copying foreign brands, falsifying documents, and bribing customs officials. This short-term gain has now exploded into long-term collapse. The geopolitical implications are profound. The United States, Mexico, and Canada are drawing closer under the USMCA framework, determined to block China's backdoor access. Europe is investing heavily in anti-smuggling technologies, promising that the crackdown has only just begun. Even developing nations, once eager to receive cheap Chinese goods, are becoming wary of the flood of counterfeits that erode their own industries. The abandoned containers in Mexico and the seizures in Europe have become symbols of a global consensus. Chinese trade practices are no longer tolerable. For Chinese exporters, the future looks grim. Costs of compliance are skyrocketing, but without compliance, containers will be seized. Buyers in Europe and North America increasingly demand airtight documentation, full traceability, and proof of origin. Those who cannot provide it are being cut out of the market. Meanwhile, the domestic economy in China is faltering, with real estate collapsing, domestic consumption stagnant, and unemployment among youth soaring. The export sector was supposed to be a lifeline. Instead, it has become another crack in the dam. The stories pouring out from China's provinces reveal a society on edge. Workers confess that they no longer see a future. Some who once earned stable wages in electronics factories now deliver food or drive ride-hailing cars for meager pay. Others remain jobless, surviving on small savings and support from extended families. One worker lamented that his entire household of 6, with 4 adults, had 3 people unemployed at the same time. Such collective joblessness was once unimaginable. Now it is becoming common. Even among the educated elite, disillusionment runs deep. In Shanghai, crowds of delivery riders at traffic lights include many with bachelor's, master's, and even doctoral degrees. It is no longer a joke that to deliver food in China, one needs a university degree. At job fairs, tens of thousands compete for a handful of positions, with ratios as extreme as 89-1. Some graduates from prestigious universities cannot even hand in their resumes, rejected outright at corporate booths. The situation has been described by experts as a social gray rhino, a massive, obvious danger ignored until it tramples stability. Meanwhile, the government in Beijing continues to stage parades, waste billions on vanity projects, and pour money abroad in geopolitical games while ignoring the economic pain at home. The result is growing anger among citizens who see their sacrifices squandered. The abandoned containers in Mexico and the seized shipments across Europe are not only a blow to trade, they are a mirror reflecting the corruption, negligence, and decay of a system that places political survival above the livelihood of its people. The crisis also exposes how deeply China has entangled global supply chains. For years, international retailers turned a blind eye to dubious practices as long as prices stayed low. Now, those same companies face reputational risks, supply disruptions, and soaring costs as enforcement tightens. The world is learning that cheap comes at a price, and that price is trust. The situation may mark the beginning of a historic realignment in global trade, with Mexico and Europe setting precedents for strict oversight and the United States pushing its allies to follow suit. China may find its export routes shrinking dramatically. Nations once dependent on Chinese goods may diversify to Southeast Asia. Ultimately, the spectacle of abandoned containers is not just a logistical story, it is a moral one. It illustrates the consequences of building prosperity on counterfeits, deceit, and exploitation. The workers who toiled in Chinese factories deserved better. The consumers, misled by fake products, deserved better. And the global trading system, undermined by smuggling and fraud, deserved better. China now stands at a crossroads. It can reform, embrace transparency, and genuinely compete on innovation and quality. Or it can continue down the path of denial, clinging to an unsustainable model until the cracks widen into collapse. The abandoned containers at Manzanillo and the seized cargoes across Europe suggest that the world has already made its choice. It will no longer tolerate China's counterfeit empire. The question is whether Beijing will recognize that choice before it is too late. When digging deeper into the contents of the abandoned and seized containers, a disturbing pattern emerges. It is not simply that Chinese exporters are cutting corners. They are saturating the global market with goods that undermine trust, quality, and safety. The list of seized products reads like an index of counterfeit consumer culture. Perfumes imitating luxury French brands, cosmetics laced with unsafe chemicals, handbags sporting false logos from Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and Prada, sneakers cloned from Nike and Adidas, tennis rackets, sports gear, tiles, tools, tires, and textiles. These are not small black market operations, they are massive industrial-scale reproductions designed to trick consumers worldwide. Take cosmetics as an example. In Mexico, customs officials revealed that many seized items carried fake packaging nearly indistinguishable from legitimate products. Yet chemical tests uncovered high levels of mercury, lead, and banned dyes. These products were not merely illegal, they were dangerous, exposing users to long-term health risks. Exporters had no qualms about poisoning foreign markets if it meant securing quick profits. For ordinary families, especially in developing nations where regulatory oversight is weak, the damage could be devastating. Counterfeit perfumes were another striking case. Branded boxes, bottles with holograms, and carefully copied French or Italian labels all gave the illusion of authenticity. But laboratory tests found them to be little more than water mixed with alcohol and industrial solvents. Some even contained methanol, a toxic substance that can cause blindness. Yet these fake perfumes were exported in bulk, filling entire containers meant for resale in Latin America, Africa, and even parts of Europe. What looks glamorous on store shelves hides a cocktail of fraud and hazard. Then there are the textiles, perhaps the most pervasive of all. In Europe's raids, mountains of counterfeit clothes were seized, many branded as Adidas, Zara, or Nike. The scale was enormous, entire warehouses filled with shirts, pants, and jackets labeled with global fashion logos but stitched together in sweatshops. Workers producing these items earned a fraction of legal wages, often under unsafe conditions, while exporters pocketed profits by skipping taxes and duties. The impact extended beyond lost revenue. It undercut legitimate retailers and destroyed jobs in Europe's textile sector. The scooter and e-bike scandal highlighted another dimension of Chinese trade malpractice. Authorities discovered thousands of electric vehicles grossly undervalued in shipping documents. A scooter worth $500 was declared at $100. Not only did this cheat customs out of proper duties, it also distorted the global market. Cheap, underpriced imports flooded into European cities, threatening local manufacturers who could not compete with fraudulent pricing. Even worse, many of the seized e-bikes and scooters failed safety standards. Faulty batteries, poor wiring, and substandard frames created fire hazards and accidents on the streets. In the rush to dominate global markets, Chinese exporters placed no value on consumer safety. Sports goods were also a significant portion of the seized cargo. Fake tennis rackets, soccer balls, and shoes mimicked well-known Western brands. While visually convincing, they performed poorly and broke easily. Athletes and consumers paid for quality, but received junk. This deception was particularly cruel for poorer families who stretched their budgets to buy what they thought were branded products, only to be cheated. One telling example was the fake tire trade. Investigators in Mexico uncovered containers filled with tires that carried international brand names but were manufactured with cheap rubber compounds. Road tests revealed them to be unsafe, prone to blowouts at high speeds. These counterfeit tires were not just a matter of fraud, they were lethal, putting drivers and passengers at mortal risk. Yet the exporters showed no remorse, only abandoning the shipments when inspections grew too strict. Household tools and hardware were another recurring theme. Containers full of drills, wrenches, and saws carried fake labels from respected global manufacturers. These tools often snapped or failed under minimal pressure, putting workers at risk of injury. Such products undermined the trust that consumers placed in global trade, reinforcing the perception that made in China equated to poor quality and deception. Even more alarming were the toys. Customs officials found containers packed with children's toys that bore counterfeit branding from Disney, Marvel, and other entertainment giants. Tests revealed the presence of toxic paints, sharp edges, and parts small enough to cause choking hazards. Exporters who filled entire containers with dangerous toys were effectively gambling with the lives of children. That such shipments were abandoned at ports illustrates the sheer disregard for human safety in pursuit of profit. Luxury fakes were also prevalent. Customs seizures in Europe uncovered jewelry, watches, and designer accessories worth millions, all counterfeits. Rolex, Omega, Cartier, Chanel. The names were there, but the craftsmanship was not. Many pieces were coated with cheap metals that tarnished within days. Yet the market for such fakes is lucrative, and exporters had no problem producing them by the ton. The broader picture is that Chinese exporters have industrialized counterfeiting to the point where it rivals legitimate production. This is not the work of a few bad actors. It is systemic, supported by entire supply chains, freight forwarders, and even corrupt officials. The seized goods across Mexico and Europe expose how deeply this shadow economy has become embedded in Chinese export machine. The consequences ripple outward. For Mexico, the influx of counterfeit goods devastates local industries. Small businesses producing footwear, clothing, or basic tools cannot survive against underpriced fakes. For Europe, the flood of undervalued imports erodes trust, reduces tax revenue, and undermines legitimate companies. For consumers worldwide, it means paying for goods that are unsafe, poor in quality, or outright dangerous. Industry insiders warn that what is being seized is only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. For every container caught, dozens may slip through. Customs officials themselves admit they cannot possibly inspect every shipment, but with technologies like X-rays and gamma scanners, they are now flagging more than ever. The fact that so many exporters chose to abandon containers rather than defend them proves how widespread the fraud is. This pattern of deception also reveals the broader desperation within China's economy. As domestic growth stalls, real estate collapses, and youth unemployment soars, exporters are under enormous pressure to generate foreign currency. Instead of innovating or improving quality, many take the easy route: counterfeit goods, false invoices, undervaluation, and smuggling. In the short term, it buys time. In the long term, it erodes China's reputation irreparably. The abandoned containers filled with perfumes, cosmetics, scooters, textiles, tires, tools, and toys thus tell a story larger than trade fraud. They reflect a collapsing model of growth, one that relies on deception rather than value. The workers who produced these items may never be paid. The families who depended on export earnings are left in despair. And the countries that received these goods now face economic and social costs of cleaning up the mess. If the world once tolerated these practices for the sake of cheap goods, the tide has clearly turned. Mexico's ports, Europe's customs offices, and America's tariffs all signal that the era of blind acceptance is over. The contents of those containers may now rot in storage yards, but their legacy is clear. China's counterfeit empire has been exposed, and the global community is no longer willing to shoulder the burden.